Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargav, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. In this episode, we talk about the reasons why the farming sector did well in the last financial year, and whether that could happen this year as well. We also take a quick look at Kamala Harris's conversation with PM Modi about COVID-19 vaccines. But first, we talk about Class 12 exams being cancelled. For some time now, there have been apprehensions about Class 12 students appearing for examinations in the middle of this pandemic. This is why earlier this week, citing uncertain conditions due to COVID-19 and feedback from various stakeholders, the central government cancelled this year's CBSE board examination for Class 12 students. And following this decision, even the ISC examinations were scrapped. Now, the decision to cancel the CBSE exams was taken following a meeting which was chaired by Prime Minister Narendra Modi. And before this meeting, there were other options that were also being considered. To talk about what these options were, how students will be marked now, and what other state boards are planning, we talked to Ritika Chopra, who reports on education for the Indian Express. Ritika, now the CBSE Class 12 board exams have been cancelled, but before the government decided this, what were the other options that were being considered?
So before the announcement came on the 1st of June, a week before that, government had consulted CBSE and the CBSE had presented the government with two options. I must clarify that at that point, when they presented the government with two options, both these options meant that the exams were going to be conducted, but in two different formats. I mean, they had the option of conducting in two different formats. The option A, or rather the first option being that you hold the exam in the existing format, but only for the major subjects. By major subjects, we mean that there are subjects like basically languages. In humanities, you have history, political science, sociology. For sciences, you obviously have physics, chemistry, biology. So there are 19 major subjects out of these 170 odd subjects that are offered by CBSE. So they decided that we will hold exams only for the 19 subjects, and for the rest of it, we will basically tabulate results for the remaining subjects based on the performance in the major subjects. I would like to point out here that normally a class 12 CBSE student has about 5 to 6 subjects, a minimum of 5 and a maximum of 6 subjects that he or she takes in class 12. And of these, usually 3 are major subjects. So CBSE was hoping that if they conduct examinations only for 19 major, most of the students would have sat for at least 3 subjects.
Okay, so that was option A, where exams would have been held only for the major subjects. What was option B?
So for option B, again, they said that we will again conduct exams only for 19 major subjects, but this will be done in a truncated format. And what they mean by that is that they were proposing to hold the exam, rather each paper would be of 90 minutes as opposed to 3 hours. And under this format, they said that we will allow the students to sit for the exam in their own school as opposed to an examination center, which was earlier designated for that purpose. So if they sit for the exam in their own school, which means there'll be fewer students, and hence they were hoping that there would be less crowding, because in examination centers, there would be a larger number of students coming in from different schools to sit for the exam. So these were the two options majorly proposed by CBSE to the government. The government then on the 23rd of May called a national consultation with the states to discuss these two options. And after that, they requested all the states to submit their feedback in writing. And once that feedback was collated, they discovered that 32 states were in favor of holding the exam, rather going ahead with the Class 12 board exams. Of these 32 states and UTs, 29 were either in favor of option B, that is conducting the exam in a shorter format or a curtailed format, or they said you either conduct it in a shorter format or we're okay with whatever the state decides. So the consensus was that the government should go ahead with the examination. However, now we're being told that there was a third option that the board had, but it didn't discuss, rather the government had, but this was never really discussed because the education ministry was pretty keen on conducting the examination, the minister himself. But once the matter reached the prime minister's office, apparently the third option was also discussed, which was, of course, to scrap the exam and assess students through an alternative mechanism. And I think in the last, say, about 72 to 48 hours ahead of the decision being announced, this was discussed as a possibility and then eventually announced on the 1st of June.
So now, considering that many states wanted the exams to actually take place, how have they reacted now?
So I didn't point this out in your last question, is that while there are 32 states which were okay or rather wanted the government to go ahead with the examination, there were four which were completely against it. That was Delhi, Maharashtra, Goa, and Andaman and Nicobar Islands. So once, of course, the government announced the cancellation, most of the states have welcomed the decision. In fact, a lot of the BJP ruled states now have taken cue and gone ahead and cancelled their own Class 12 examination. Even opposition ruled state like Rajasthan has also announced the cancellation of its Class 12 examination. So the government was hoping that whatever we decide with regard to the CBSE Class 12 examination may be a signal of sorts for the states, and the states may follow suit. Although, I mean, states are still free to go ahead and conduct the examination. For instance, Bihar has already finished their exam. It usually happens in February, March, and they managed to complete it before the second wave hit. And Kerala, as of now, has still announced its Class 12 examination, hasn't cancelled it. West Bengal has announced that it will hold the Class 12 examination, hasn't cancelled it. So I guess this is still a developing story on that front. And maybe in another week's time, we'll have a better idea of whether all states, I mean, of course, with the exception of states like Bihar or Meghalaya, which have finished their examination, I mean, whether the remaining are going to go ahead with the exam or not.
Also, what do we know about exactly how students will be marked now?
So, I mean, it's obvious that the results would be tabulated based on a student's performance in internal school assessments. What we don't know for sure right now is whether this will be based on a student's performance only in class 12 in school, or whether maybe the board would want these schools to maybe take a student's performance in class 11 also into account, or maybe even 10. That is something we don't know for sure. And to ensure that the schools don't inflate their marks in order to produce, say, good results, they will ask the schools to make sure that whatever marks that they award to their students based on their performance internal assessment shouldn't be too different or shouldn't be really big departure from the school's average performance over the last few years in the class 12 examination. I mean, at least that's what they'll try and do to ensure that the schools don't artificially inflate marks for their students. But we will maybe have to wait for a week or even more to find out what the actual alternative assessment scheme is.
And one thing that we have discussed previously on the podcast as well is that there is this lack of a diversified system when it comes to assessing class 12 students and even class 10 students. So could this be an opportunity for CBSE to, look beyond this traditional system of final exams?
Look, CBSE does encourage schools to assess students throughout the year. It's just that it happens a lot in class 10, but what basically class 12 is a crucial in the sense there are many students who are preparing for the entrance examinations like JEE and JEE Advanced. So while schools may claim that they're assessing students, a lot of these students are not attending classes very often. So one doesn't really know whether how robust the system of internal assessment is in class 12. This, of course, I mean, it's an opportunity. I personally feel the government should have ideally planned for they had a year for this, and they should have planned for such a scenario and maybe introduce an alternative, just as how they decided to reduce the syllabus for class 12 by 30%. They should have maybe even asked schools to make sure that students are being assessed regularly. It doesn't have to be through tests. There are other methods of assessments as well. Examination is just one tool of assessment. So maybe they should have planned in advance. And even now, I mean, even after this, given that we are expecting, I mean, pandemic doesn't end with the second wave, there may be more. So maybe this is an opportunity for CBSE to come up with alternative methods of assessment and ensure that they are prepared to assess students through another mechanism as opposed to cancelling exams at the last moment. Look, if the board had to cancel, then they could have done this in February. doing this at this moment makes it a little tricky for higher education institutions, at least those institutions which depend on the board examination results for admissions into colleges and universities. So we don't know whether they will, ideally, they should, of course, but we don't know whether they will accept these results as being legitimate enough for them to admit students. Like last year, the IITs did not take the class 12 board marks into account for whatever reason. I mean, they told us unofficially that, look, we're not sure whether these marks are actually a reflection of a student's performance. Schools may have inflated marks and stuff. So it's not that easy. And then the board will have to plan in advance. It has kind of, in a way, wasted a year. But I don't think they should waste another year, and they should have sort of an alternative mechanism in place.
So, the big question about how universities will take in students still remains unanswered. Though Indian Express's Aranya Shankar has for the past few days been talking to officials from the Delhi University about exactly this issue. Delhi University is, of course, a place that attracts students from all over the country, many of whom take the CBSE exams. She now joins us to talk about what DU officials have been saying about this.
So, as of now, the most feasible and probable option that Delhi University is considering is just going by the criteria that the CBSE decides to calculate 12th board marks for students. Because initially, what the university had said was that they will try to move away from a totally cutoff based criteria, because we've seen that year after year these cutoffs are just skyrocketing, touching 100, and they sort of become meaningless because everybody is scoring very high. So there was an attempt, the dean of admissions has been saying for the last few years, the vice chancellor, the acting vice chancellor said this year that they would ideally like to move to a system where at least 50% of the component can be an entrance test. And what they were planning to go for was the SUSET, which is the Central Universities Common Entrance Test that the government was planning to implement this year for central universities across the country. But now with the situation, with the pandemic, it seems very, very unlikely that that will be implemented. So as of now, what DU has said is that they will just go by the board criteria. They will release their cutoffs based on that. And if and when SUSET is implemented, they will follow that.
And because of this, is there a sense that the cutoffs might actually be different this year?
So basically, the university has not yet started the process of consultation, sitting with the principals, meeting. So it's difficult to get an official version on whether they think that will happen. But yes, of course, I think there will be a difference because boards do tend to be more, the checking is much more lenient. Students do tend to score a lot higher in class 10th and 12th compared to 9th and 11th. So if this year, if CBSE decides to evaluate students on the basis of, say, pre-boards or the internal assessment or the last 3 or 4 or 2 years marks, then my sense is that there should be a difference in the scores that students get, and therefore we won't see such skyrocketing cutoffs this year. But I think a lot of that would depend on how CBSE decides to evaluate, how lenient they are while giving those marks, and ultimately I think then that will impact how DU releases its cutoffs.
And you talked about the Central University's common entrance test, but is there any other sort of entrance test that the university might be looking at? If not a common one, then maybe a separate one of its own?
So especially for DU, that seems like, I don't think that is an option. It's not something that they're completely rejecting, but the chances of that happening are minuscule, because also one apprehension again is that the whole reason for the boards to be cancelled was that students are not able to sit for a physical exam. So then does it make sense to make them sit for an admission entrance test? And DU has never really said we'll have our own entrance till now. The only option they were considering was a SUSET. And other universities in the city, like Ambedkar University, which also depends a lot on the class 12 board marks, has also said the same thing, that they will go by the CBSE criteria to hold admissions. So it seems unlikely that they will have their own entrance exams. But I think in JNU, because class 12 board exam marks are only a qualifying criteria, you only need a basic minimum, a percentage of marks to sit for the entrance test. Whether board exams are cancelled or what is the criteria that CBSE devises to finally promote students, what is the mark that they score, I don't think that will make a huge difference in how JNU holds admissions to its own undergraduate courses.
And Aranya, could you also talk about how principals and the administration in the Delhi University have reacted to this decision?
So I think the DU administration has welcomed it, because more than anything else, I think there is a feeling among a large section of both principal and the administration that this is what was needed at this time. It was not going to be possible to hold exams at such a large scale. But having said that, there are apprehensions, at least, among a few principals who don't know how CBSE criterion will play out in terms of DU admissions, because Delhi University doesn't get students from just the CBSE board, they get from a lot of state boards as well. So the Ramjas college principal, for example, Manoj Khanna, was not very keen on, I mean, he had apprehensions about the CBSE criteria, because he's saying internal assessment varies from school to school. It's not a standardized test. So how will that impact DU admissions, whether you can trust that one school's internal assessment is comparable to another one? Those are the kind of apprehensions they have. But a lot of this will become much more clear once the CBSE actually comes out with its criteria, and I think then there will be more clarity. And the DU administration also has said that its process of holding discussions on how the admissions will take place, etc., will only begin once the CBSE criteria and the CBSE results for class 12 are announced.
And next, we talk about the rural economy. Earlier this week, the government had released the latest estimates for India's economic growth for the last financial year. It made it clear that India's economy had suffered quite a bit. According to it, in 2020 to 2021, India's GDP contracted by 7.3%. But one important thing to note is that despite the overall GDP declining, India's farm sector actually grew by 3.6%. To talk about why that happened and whether it can happen again as well, Harish Damodaran joins us. Harish is Indian Express's Rural Affairs Editor and a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi. Harish, we understand that the Indian economy suffered quite a bit in the last financial year, but this did not happen to the farm sector, that is agriculture, forestry, and fishing. This sector, in fact, grew by 3.6%. Could you talk about the reasons why that happened?
Yeah, as you mentioned, I mean, this is the first time in India's history where you are having a recession and a degrowth. And it not happening because there was a drought. Normally, whenever India used to have recessions, it was triggered by two things. One was food, the other was foreign exchange. And maybe a third was fuel, basically oil. Okay, so you had the three Fs, food, fuel, and foreign exchange. One of these used to be the cause of India's recession. This time, what was unusual is it is not definitely not fuel, neither foreign exchange, because actually our foreign exchange reserves grew by about $100 billion, and we are close to $600 billion of reserves, I mean, record. And we had a bumper crop. There was no drought this time, And if you see, there was no hoarding of sugar or edible oil or grain or anything. I mean, you had only hoarding of oxygen and oxygen cylinders and remdesivir and drugs, etc. So this has been a remarkable year when you look at it from a historical perspective. First time you're having agriculture perform relatively well, and there was no large-scale starvation. And all the things which were wrong, which you saw in earlier episodes of, whether it was a recession or something, there was no shortage of food, there was no hoarding, there was no food inflation. So that is the main takeaway, I think, from the latest GDP data, if you see. Now, coming to the causes, as far as causes go, I think the one reason why, because we actually saw some growth, was the monsoon itself. You had a fantastic monsoon last year. Actually, last two monsoons have been good. 2019, I think, was the wettest in 25 years. It was the wettest year in 25 years, in quarter of a century. And 2020 also last year was very good monsoon. And not just monsoon, even the post-monsoon, you had an extended winter. So I would say, so that is number one reason. So the number one reason was good monsoon. The number two reason was the government took a conscious decision last year, not to the center, that is, the Modi government. They took a conscious decision to exclude agricultural related activities from the lockdown. So right from the beginning, they allowed farming activity to take place, movement of farm labor, movement of harvester combines, and same thing, movement of produce, sale in mandis, sale of fertilizer. So farmers were able to get access to seed, fertilizer, and all these things. So I think that was a very smart move which was made last year, not exempting agriculture related activities from the lockdown. So I would say these two were the main factors. And third, of course, I think prices also started improving. And you can see it particularly in this recent Rabi marketing season, when farmers sold mustard, when farmers sold chana, the prices this time were far higher than last year. And in the case of mustard, actually, it was even above the government's minimum support price. So this was a very unique kind of a moment where farmers benefited more, both from higher production and also remunerative prices in most cases. And that's what I call a sort of a Goldilocks moment. So when both production and prices were right. Whereas in earlier years, production was affected because of drought, like in 2014, 15, 2018, 19 also. Or prices were very low, like in 2019. Or immediately after demonetization, prices crashed. Whereas this time, if you ask me, I think the overall stars went favorable towards agriculture.
And how unusual is this? How often do we see this happening?
I would say that 2020-21 was the best year for agriculture since 2013-14. From both sides, both prices were good as well as production also was good. So I think virus was bad luck, but two good monsoons were very good luck. And let's hope for a third successive monsoon. And that's what at least the IMD, the Met Department is saying, that we are going to have a third successive very good monsoon. That's what their latest forecast says.
So does this mean that the growth we saw in 2020 to 2021, could that happen this year as well?
One difference, especially, I would say, the one big difference is, of course, last year, COVID was not an issue at all in rural areas, right? It was mostly in cities, in urban centers, whereas there were hardly any cases in rural India. And most people in rural India didn't even have an idea what this COVID is, And whenever we went into the villages, we never saw anybody wearing masks. And most of them were very curious to know, what is this? Why is it that we are seeing such a lot of it in television? There was a lot of bravado saying, "Ye kya hota hai? What is this corona? Corona cannot do anything to us." That was a general this thing. But I think this year, now what we are seeing is the cases have really spread. And definitely even rural areas have not been spared, But again, the encouraging thing is the cases seem to be coming down. At least going by the official data, the cases seem to be coming down. And in any case, the real sowing, sowing for the coming Kharif season, it will only start after the middle of this June. And that is when the monsoon hits most part of the country. It starts arriving. So I think there is enough time between now and maybe 15 days from now when the plantings really start, etc. But definitely there is going to be an impact on sentiment. There is fear. And people, even in rural areas, the same people who were asking, what is this corona? And that bravado definitely has disappeared. And there is palpable fear. So another thing which will matter is the pace of vaccination and how much we are able to vaccinate even in rural areas. Because in fact, if you ask me, maybe there is more urgency to vaccinate in those areas because there you don't have any health infrastructure. So the only protection you can give people is through the vaccination. So at least you can give them some immunity. And probably that will be much more effective. Whereas we know that building healthcare facilities and all is going to take time. Obviously it's desirable, but you cannot build hospitals, etc. in 6 months, etc. Whereas you can vaccinate in rural areas. And that's very important even for sentiment,
And could you elaborate a bit on how things would be affected if this fear, this apprehension about COVID continues?
See, if there is fear, people will want to put off buying. They would like to postpone purchases, especially of, say, two-wheelers, gold, even, say, rebuilding their houses, construction. Everything will be put off because people would want to like to save for any episode of hospitalization, etc. So you will see a lot of precautionary saving kind of behavior, and that's what fear does. And people may not be induced to spend. Whereas last year, I think rural areas were the ones which actually saved the day. You ask cement companies, ask FMCG companies, and of course, tractor companies. They all sold. But this time, if I fear that whatever. I may have to go to the hospital. My wife has to go to the hospital. I may have to spend 3-4 lakh rupees, maybe 5 lakh rupees. So there will be fear. So the best way actually would be to accelerate the pace of vaccination, especially in rural areas where there is no health infrastructure. And probably the rural economy is a better bet today than any other sector, because at the end of the day, everybody has to eat. And food ultimately will come from rural areas. So it's very important. I mean, the fact that agriculture did well last year, so the government should continue to depend on this. Agriculture will be a never fail sector if the monsoons are good. And the monsoons, it looks, going by the forecast, we should have a good monsoon. 3 good monsoons in a year is, it's fantastic. And the government can count itself very lucky if you have 3 successive good monsoons.
And in the end, we talk about Prime Minister Narendra Modi speaking with United States Vice-President Kamala Harris. According to a statement issued by the Prime Minister's office, during a call between the two, Harris told Modi that the United States will begin sharing vaccines with India along with other countries by the end of June. The two leaders also discussed ongoing efforts to strengthen the health supply chain between the US and India, including the area of vaccine manufacturing. PM Modi later thanked her for this assurance and all the support and solidarity from the US government, businesses, and Indian diaspora. Now, this happened as US President Joe Biden laid out the plan to share some 25 million of a planned 80 million COVID-19 vaccine doses with the rest of the world, including India. In a statement, President Biden provided details on how the US will allocate the first 25 million vaccines. Biden said that at least 75% of these doses, nearly 19 million, will be shared through COVAX, including approximately 6 million doses for Latin America and the Caribbean, approximately 7 million for South and Southeast Asia, and approximately 5 million for Africa. He added that the remaining doses, just over 6 million, will be shared directly with countries experiencing surges, those in crisis, and other partners and neighbors including Canada, Mexico, India, and the Republic of Korea. The long-awaited vaccine sharing plan comes as demand for shots in the US have dropped significantly, as more than 63% of adults have received at least one dose, and as global inequities in supply have become more glaring. You were listening to 3 Things by The Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargav, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.